Yeah. So we're going to continue our study of Shankya. And as it can be quite technical, but it is very rewarding if we try and apply ourselves to understand it. And I was just now reading over what we're going to cover today for the last 45 minutes, and I found it very enlightening to actually try and understand it. So what I'm going to do, in order to help us to understand it as best as we can, I'm going to try something here. In the meantime, you can put your hands up for reading. So just bear with me. I'm going to try and share my iPad screen, and I'm going to take you through what's being read. You'll see. So just bear with me. Stop share. Okay, so let's. Now, share content, screen, start broadcast. Okay, that's good. Something's happening there. Very good. Okay, what you're seeing, you're supposed to see. Right? And we come here. Okay, so forgive my handwriting, but this is some notes I made, followed on from last week's class. As soon as we finished, then I reread what we read together. So I wasn't 100% happy with not being able to grasp it completely. So I went and I took some notes so that I can understand. And I can share them with you as we read. All right? Sound like a good plan? We'll just, this I can adjust from my iPad. And I can also, I can write things as well here. You see like this, show you. All right? So I'm going to be scribbling a bit. All right? So welcome everyone again, for those who just joined to our Sankapa Kamudi reading. And who wants to, Anupama Gopika, she has a hand up first. So before we begin, let's offer some pranam mantras to Ram Acharya, Srila Prabhupada, Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Vistaya Putale, Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swam Namane, Namaste Sarasati Devi Gauravani Puchaline, Nivasesha Sunyavadi Pashtatara Satanane. Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Sari Gaura Bhaktavinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so then we can begin reading. We're on page 176. Those who have Sankapa Kamudi, and let you know again, in case you're interested, there is copies of Sankapa Kamudi in our shop. Okay, so Anupama, you can begin reading.
Okay, okay. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, and I might be asking you to pause, okay?
Okay.
So get ready for that, because
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's it. You got it. Yeah, bottom of page 176.
To understand the functioning of the mind, it is advantageous to appreciate the evolution of the subtle body from the point at which the living entity comes into contact with material nature. That description now follows. When the animist combination of material elements, pradhan, becomes manifest, it's known as prakriti, or the material nature.
So Lord, just pause there, just so you can see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So just to help you understand, I'm taking you through it. Okay, carry on.
Yeah. Right. The Lord places the living entities along with their individual destinies into the womb of this material nature, and then agitates the modes of nature by his potency of time. Thus activated, material nature gives birth to the effulgent Mahatattva, which is seed of the universe, in which the modes of nature become dominant, and which is represented in the body by consciousness. When the Mahatattva is infused with the energy of the Lord, then false ego, ahankara, is manifested in three features: goodness, passion, and ignorance. These threefold aspects of false ego, endowed with the three modes of nature, are the source of the other internal senses, known as antakarana, as well as the further 20 elements, the visible ingredients of creation. The modes of nature affect the false ego in different ways. When the false ego is dominated by goodness, it gives rise to the mind. When dominated by passion, to intelligence, and when dominated by ignorance, to the gross and subtle elements. In truth, the products of the threefold false ego exceed in number those three mentioned above. However, to focus on sankalpa as a function of the mind, we address only those derivatives of ankara that are most relevant. Thus, following the lead of Srimad Bhagavatam, we begin by describing the unfolding of the mind. From the false ego of goodness, another transformation takes place. From this evolves the mind, whose thoughts and reflections give rise to desire. Prominent functions of the mind are thinking, feeling, and willing, which are fueled by information from the senses and are stored within the mind, which interestingly remains unaware of the significance of its contents other than to experience them as desirable or undesirable. Notably, Thakur Bhaktivinoda describes a fivefold division of the mind's functioning, while Srila Prabhupada departmentalizes the mind into thinking, feeling, and willing. The Thakura equates thinking to gathering and retaining information, feeling to sorting and simplifying impressions caused by the information, and willing to reasoning. He writes, through the senses, the impression of the external world are carried to the brain via the nerves. Thus, the first function of the mind, the internal sense, gathers data from the external world. Then the mind, by its second function, maintains the data in the memory. By its third function, the mind, by combining and separating the data, produces impressions. By the fourth function, the mind classifies the impressions according to their qualities and thereby reduces the complexity. It then isolates particular items to increase the number again by further analysis. By the fifth function of the mind, meaning is derived from the conglomeration of impressions. This fifth function is called reasoning. By means of reasoning, the mind discerns what the person should do and should not do. Through the faculty of reasoning, all material and mental sciences have been developed. This is how the mind thinks in terms of dualities like pleasure and pain or happiness and distress. It is also interesting to note that the mind standard of desirable and undesirable is based on impressions made by previous sensory experiences through the knowledge acquiring senses, namely the eyes, the ears, and so on.
I would just pause there.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to highlight that last paragraph that was just read. I don't know if this helps, all this here. And it helps me to try and, excuse my handwriting, but it helps me to try and understand the how it's developing here.
Murali Prabhu, what
Yes.
is number one? Because it's difficult to understand. Number two is maintains. Number three is impression.
Gathers, excuse my spelling, gathers data.
Thank you.
Gathers data.
Thank you.
So a main point to is this last paragraph here. It's interesting to note that the mind's standards of desirable and undesirable is based on impressions made by previous sensory experiences through the knowledge acquiring senses, namely the eyes, ears, and so on. So that statement plays a role in how this chapter develops. For instance, the reason that the mind, say, may focus on a particular material enjoyment because it imagines or it's had experience of that before. So therefore, it almost tastes that experience as a memory. So that's why it can be hard for someone to give up gross sense gratification in the beginning, is because the mind still retains memories of that experience. And according to, I could say, so according to how you interpret that, whether pleasurable or not, the mind will contemplate that. Yeah. So I try and now, having said all that, the mind is not conscious. It's not a conscious entity, but the mind itself carries impressions like a sponge. So, for example, if someone is practicing Krishna consciousness for how long, a year, 2 years, or whatever it may be, 5, 10, 15, whatever years, still the impressions from previous sensory enjoyments, say, is still within the mind. So therefore, it still presents itself, that sensory enjoyment presents itself as a possible experience of pleasure. But it's again, the mind is not a conscious entity. It's just a way that we have conditioned the mind. So therefore, Vishani Nivatam Te Hershate, Vado Vasham Vado Pisha Param Drishna Nivatate. That's why when we take up Krishna consciousness, if we can become steady in our principles and in our vows, that will make us more, or in other words, that will weaken the materialistic mind, because we won't be following its previous dictations. So in other words, with intelligence, we can understand that what the mind identifies is enjoyment. We now understand it will not give me enjoyment. It will lead me into degradation and lead me to suffer. So intelligence is above the mind. So we begin to use the intelligence. Yeah, that's kind of a synopsis of what we're covering today. Is there any questions about that? Or
can I ask something, Murli Prabhu, please?
Yes, please.
So by chanting, we can clean the mind and get rid of those impressions.
Yes, ultimately, yes.
But the mirror of the mind, so then it can reflect Krishna.
Yeah, Jeto Dapanam Marjanam. But that doesn't happen overnight. That takes some time to re-collaborate the mind. Yeah. So in other words, the more we chant Hare Krishna, the more experiences we have with chanting Hare Krishna, the more it will be able to, the more it will flood out thoughts of any type of so-called pleasure. But yeah, in essence, what Mihai is saying is correct.
So that's why we think we are the body, because our mind makes us think we are the body, but we are not the body. We can't perceive the soul because our past experiences. Yeah,
because within the mind, it's like a sponge, and it carries data. Like here, like it gathers data. This is from Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He says here. Let me just do this 1 second. Like here, it's not very. Carries data. Then it maintains that data. Then it creates an impression. Yeah.
So then there's the illusion thinking we are the mind, but we are not.
Yeah. And then it begins to classify what is good, what is bad. Then it may isolate what is good here. Then it comes up with reasonings to engage in sense gratification.
And then we are lost because we don't chant Hare Krishna.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah.
It is like internet history and then suggesting you advertisement according to what you were searching.
Could you just say that once more? I missed the beginning.
It's like our internet history, it suggests you advertising according to what you've been
Yeah, that's a very wonderful example. Yeah, just like your internet, your YouTube search, or your history, And according to where you've been, then it will give you different options for purchasing things, different adverts, like that. Yeah, it's a very good example. Yeah, I think I'm gonna, yeah, so yeah, got it. Very good. Anybody else? So we read through that quite quick, but this is what was there. Okay, let's continue reading then. Hopefully we're all on board with where we are presently. This section is called the unfolding of the mind. It's Maharaj is using Shankar is unfolding the mind and describing how it functions and why it functions and why it goes in specific directions. Yeah.
Shall I continue, Prabhu?
Yeah, you can continue for perhaps a few more, couple more paragraphs.
Okay.
Yeah, just till carry on to 180 in the stars.
Okay. For example, this is on page 179. For example, when a hungry person eats a piece of bread and butter, then that experience denotes a standard of happiness derived from eating. When, however, he later eats a 10-course feast, that experience recalibrates the mind standards of what happens from a meal. What happiness, so where am I? Standard of what happens from a meal entails. Furthermore, while the overall experience of the feast is favorable, the taste of bitter melon, an acquired taste, may at first be appraised as unfavorable. Thus, there remains a mixed reaction from one preparation to another. From this example, it can be seen that the mind is more or less victimized by sense impressions. And because sense gratification is fleeting, the mind is restless and unsteady. Furthermore, because the mind is habituated to sense gratification, it is also obstinate and strong. Arjuna equates these problematic traits of the mind with the impossible effort of trying to control the wind. For the mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong, O Krishna, and to subdue it, I think, is more difficult than controlling the wind. The calamitous result of the mind's acquired traits is that it bewilders and overcomes the intelligence to which it is meant to be subservient. And when the intelligence is thus bewildered...
Yeah, so just that point that the mind becomes, the intelligence is supposed to be above the mind, but the intelligence, because of bewilderment, becomes a slave to the mind. Yeah. Okay, carry on, Kim. Yeah.
The calamitous result of the mind's acquired traits is that it bewilders and overcomes the intelligence to which it is meant to be subservient. And when the intelligence is thus bewildered, it loses its sense of discrimination and falsely identifies with the body and the mind, forfeiting its inherent governance over both. Identification with the body further ushers in both the mode of passion and a concomitant host of sufferings for the mind, which by nature is in the mode of goodness and thus happy. For example, the mind becomes obsessed with making plans for further sensual enjoyment, constantly accepting and rejecting sense objects as they become favorable or unfavorable to its ends. By such sustained absorption of the mind in the lower modes of nature, a living entity is degraded by range of material desires, which cause further fruitive activity and hence further entanglement. All this confusion reinforces the false ego or the sense of false bodily identification. While yogis may make various attempts to bring the mind under control by regulation and renunciation, unless the mind is purified, it remains at large risk and a constant source of anguish. To highlight the futile efforts of the non-devotee yogis, Lord Krishna gives a wonderful example of the uncured disease. Just as an improperly treated disease recurs and gives repeated distress to the patient, the mind that is not completely purified of its perverted tendencies will remain attached to material things and repeatedly torment the imperfect yogi. To help devotee gain mastery over their minds, Srimad Bhagavatam repeatedly describes the process by which the mind becomes ensnared in sense objects and sense gratification. One especially educational description was taught by the Hamsa Avatara to Lord Brahma and the Kumaras. We will now cite some of the Lord's teachings on this aspect of Sankhya philosophy.
Okay, perhaps you pause there. Perhaps you can stop there. Okay.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Nice reading. So we're highlighting the problem here with the mind, and we're highlighting its conditioned nature. So Maharaj has taken us how the whole thing began, right from here, from Pradhan to Prakriti. Then Krishna places the jiva into Prakriti according to their destiny, according to their karma. Yeah. Then Prakriti becomes agitated with time. Then Mahatattva, the seed of the universe, is created, the modes, which is the modes of nature, and then represented by consciousness, then false ego, and manifests in different ways, etc. I won't go over the whole thing in detail again. But, this is where we end up. Yeah. We've been tormented by the mind to one degree or another, definitely in the conditioned platform. Any questions or comments on this? All right. Hope it's making some.
Krishna Prabhuji, sorry, can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please, Mother. I can try and answer. Yes.
Okay. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, it's saying that the intelligence is higher than mind.
Yes.
Then why is it that the mind cannot be controlled by the intelligence?
Well, that's
intelligence is, we know that, okay, it's a nice day. What would you do? Would you rather go on book distribution, or would you have a vegetarian barbecue in your garden or something? Then the mind would say, okay, relax with your friends and have a vegetarian barbecue. And the intelligence would say, go for the Harinam Sankirtan or distribute book. But why is it that the mind is more, you know what I mean? It's not controlled then.
Well, at least the example you gave is either one. So that's an example where you're a devotee. So you've been chanting the holy name and you have a purified heart. So at least the choices you made, they're both connected to Krishna. You know, for instance, you know, you may have a vegetarian barbecue, but I'm sure you're going to have kirtan. You're going to invite your, you know, you're going to offer what's being cooked.
It was just an example. I wouldn't have a vegetarian barbecue, but I'm just saying that why is it that the mind is generally ruling us kind of rather than the intelligence?
Well, that's exactly what we just described. This is what we've just described, exactly why. I don't know if you picked it up. This is why. Because the nature of the mind here, going back to what Bhaktivinoda Thakur explains in these 5 points here.
Allows them to make and manage.
Gathers data, maintains impressions, classifies, isolates.
Okay.
You see that? So you're just, so why is exactly what has been, I think it's, I've tried our best to explain why our mind is overpowering the intelligence.
Okay. It's because I missed this point because I'm making chips for Krishna. I thought because I don't want to miss the class. And see what I mean? This is a classic example that the mind wants to make chips for Krishna, but intelligence would have said, wait, listen to the class and then cook for Krishna, you know. That's why I missed this point. Sorry.
Don't worry. Chips, yeah, I guess it's Ekadashi, it's chips. Anyway, quick, let's get back on course before we all start thinking of chips. And so it's just habituated. And Gaya Mataji, she gave a very nice example, just like the mind acts a bit like, you know, the internet or YouTube or whatever. It keeps track of where you go. So then when you open up on the internet, it offers you things in relationship to what you have bought before. So the mind is like that. According to its previous conditioning, it absorbs impressions and absorbs ideas of what it thinks is is going to be good for one's happiness. And the basis of happiness for the mind will be always based on the body. What gave the body, what gave the subtle body gross pleasure. So then it will offer those things again. But just keep in mind, when we're describing about this, that the mind is not a conscious living entity. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just try to, I just can't bring myself to believe or agree, even though you've given these points. Like, you know, sometimes when you're in bed and you think it's a winter morning and you think, I should chant rounds early, it's better. And the mind says, oh, to have another 15 minutes. And the mind always ends up winning, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, that's it. But at least as devotees, we should take recourse that there is the fact that you're chanting 16 rounds a day, you know, that means you're doing well. That means you're battling well against the mind. The very fact that obviously you're following the regular principles, the very fact that they're offering you, the very fact that you're going to wait for a few minutes after the chips is cooked because you're going to offer it to Krishna. These are all good signs that we are going in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much, Hare Krishna.
Yeah, because for instance, there's some persons who perhaps they're unsteady in their practice of Krishna consciousness, and their mind convinces them not to follow regulative principles, convinces them it can get to a degree where they're convinced that they shouldn't chant 16 rounds, or even we should want to start eating meat again. You know, but at least we are doing, at least we're steady. Those who are steady in devotional service, then we're steadily gaining mastery over the mind. But it still takes some time because the impressions of the mind remain for quite some time. Yeah. Well, let's read on a bit and see where else we go with this example from the Hamsa avatar. Unless there's any other questions, I'm happy. Any other questions?
I was just going to ask a question, but
Yeah, please, Mother Lavanya.
I think it might. It's probably going to be answered in whatever we read next about the intelligence and what is the best method for like developing your intelligence so it controls the mind, strengthening the intelligence.
Yeah, well, it is discussed, but in essence, it means we should hear, and we should hear, for instance, discussing what we're doing now. We need to, it's called Buddhi Yoga. We need to purify the intelligence by hearing from sadhus, by hearing from scripture.
And can chanting do that, or do we specifically need to hear it?
Definitely, that's all part, we need to hear about Krishna. Yeah, we need to chant about Krishna, hear about Krishna. And that's why it's very good, it's prescribed that Nasta Preshu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya, that we should hear from sadhus, we should hear from scripture on a daily basis to strengthen the intelligence. Yeah, we need spiritual intelligence. And ultimately, as the more we're devoted to Krishna, then Krishna from within will give us, he will be our intelligence. You know, that verse, Te samsatatam yuktanam pajatam puripurvakam tadami buddhi yogam tam yenam mam upadyantite. To those who are devoted to serving me with love, pretty, I give them the intelligence by which they can come to me. Yeah, so in essence, let's see what's explained. But in essence, we need to kind of re-collaborate by hearing from sadhus, hearing from Krishna, hearing daily Srimad Bhagavatam. And if we stop doing that, our mind, because it's been so conditioned for countless births, it may gain its upper hand again. Yeah, so we have to keep on hearing to keep the mind in check. All right. Anyway, let's read a bit more. So let me just see. Any Kuna Mai, you have your hand up there. She's the only one that has a hand. You can take us forward on page 180.
The Lord, in the form of a great swan, Hamsa Alta, explained that because the living entity has been absorbed in sense gratification since time immemorial, the mind has a spontaneous inclination towards sense objects. Indeed, it may be said that the mind enters into sense objects. This means that the mind so identifies with sense objects that it takes on their characteristics. And those characteristics then go on to serve as an udipan or stimulus for further sense gratification. In this way, the mind enjoys sense objects from a distance, inspiring the senses with an even greater desire for them. The interaction between the mind and sense objects has a second perspective, which stems from the sense objects themselves. Just as the mind enters into the sense objects, it is also said that the sense objects enter the functioning of the mind and so impart their qualities to it. When the mind is obsessed with particular sense object, that sense object seems to take up residence in the mind, embedding its own qualities therein. For example, a husband may phone home to ask, "What is for lunch?" And when he hears the details of the menu, he says what he experiences. "I can just smell that dal and taste those pakoras." These fascinating truths are similarly explained thus. My dear sons, the mind has a natural proclivity to enter into material sense objects, and similarly, the sense objects enter into the mind. But both this material mind and the sense objects are merely designations that cover the spirit soul, who is part and parcel of me. From the
Let's just pause there, see if we've, you can continue reading, but any reflections or questions on this? Thought that was interesting that the mind through meditation literally invites the sense objects within. So it becomes so familiar to one. It seems so natural to go in that direction. Yeah, because one's invited to the sense objects by meditating upon them, as if one, because by meditating upon the object of the senses, one gains attachment for them because you've invited them in the mind. So therefore, it's automatic. It's on autopilot to think of that particular set of sense objects because you've invited it practically into your mind. So therefore, it seems completely natural. Yeah, you follow? There's a Dayato Vishapam Sanghashcheshu Padayati Sangatsanjit Kama Krura Vijayati. Kroda Pavati Samoha Samoha Smiti Vipramaha Smiti Bamsha Pudi Naso Pudi Nasa Parnasyati. These verses begins, then gradually one overcomes the intelligence, and then gradually one falls down. Anyway, any questions on that or any reflections? Just that.
Prabhu, can I please ask a clarification?
Yes, please. I can try.
You know, Prabhu, where in this particular verse where it says the mind has a natural proclivity.
Proclivity, yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain that a little bit? I mean, I'm thinking does it mean more like a tendency, or, you know, I'm not quite sure what it actually means.
Yeah, well, that's the conditioned mind.
Yeah.
Again, for that same reason, because the mind has been contemplating sense or enjoyment in relationship to the senses and the body since time immemorial.
Mm.
So therefore, the result is it has a natural proclivity to enter into material subjects because that's what it's been doing since time immemorial. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just natural.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, because it's since time. That's one. If anyone else has a comment on that, but I would say, yeah, it's natural proclivity.
Okay.
Or really, we're trying to get back to the pure proclivity of the mind, the spiritualized mind, is to think about Krishna. Yeah. We're trying to revive that taste for Krishna.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes, Prabhu, thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Otherwise, we can. There's an interesting part that's coming up here as well. I just kind of paraphrase it before we read it. I was reading this before, and it was one of those. Wow, that's that was. We impose, or we cover the mind. We, the soul, under false ego, cover the mind. Yeah. Anyway, let's just read on. I'm just trying to. So you can continue reading, Baba Kunamai.
From the perspective of the soul, both the mind and sense objects are false designations that cover it. To be more accurate, the soul imposes the mind and sense objects upon itself. For example, in a dream, one fabricates a body that paraphernalia. However, like the dream itself, both body and dream objects are concoctions of the mind, fabricated from what can be called a dream substance. Therefore, things like mind and sense objects are all designations made of the same false ego that the mind adopts. And although the soul is seen to stoop to such depths of foolishness, it is made of better stuff. Lord Krishna explains the superior nature of the soul in the following verse. Beside these, O mighty armed Arjun, there is another superior energy of mind which comprises the living entities who are exploiting the resources of this material inferior nature. Additionally, the Lord describes the hierarchy of the senses, both gross and subtle. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. Considering that the soul is so superior to other aspects of creation, it should be crystal clear that substances like the mind cannot cover the soul of their own accord. Rather, it is the soul that pulls a blanket covering of material elements over itself and that foolishly observes the world through the curtain of those coverings, mistakenly thinking that what it perceives is reality. Scripture likens this mistaken reality to a dream state, and according to the modes of nature affecting the soul, either goodness, passion, or ignorance. It is called being awake, dreaming, and deep dreamless sleeping, respectively. Yes.
We'll just pause there. I just want to read that sentence again. This is the one I was referring to. Rather, it is the soul that pulls a blanket of covering of material elements over itself. So it's a blanket over the self, and it observes the world through those coverings, mistakenly thinking that what it perceives is reality. Yeah. So in other words, we think the reality is the senses attracted to the sense objects, but that's because we've conditioned ourselves. We've covered the soul. So therefore, when we look out at the world, we think it's for our enjoyment, whatever shape that may be, male, female, whatever, or whatever senses and the sense objects. Yeah, we perceive that as reality. Do you follow that? Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking soul is pure, but how is it like covered? But like you said,
This is how it's covered.
yeah, we're pouring on ourselves. And yeah, for when we read it, I was thinking, soul, but why is soul pure? So why is it? Okay.
Yeah. So ultimately, the whole problem is these 5 words that Prabhupada gave to help us. You know, we are not these bodies. There's 5 words. You know, we identify with this conditioned mind. We identify with our subtle body. Yeah. So therefore, So therefore, we have created. We, the soul, have chosen to turn away from Krishna, and we've embraced a non-reality. Yeah. So yeah. Now you can continue. Unless there's any other comments on that or questions. We have 16 devotees with us. Nice. Hare Krishna, everyone. I hope you're following this. Please, best as we can. I know it's a bit technical, but it's, again, as I said in the beginning, it's very rewarding if we really try and understand this. Okay, continue, Kurumai.
Thank you. Yes, the state conditioned thought, called being awake, is from the viewpoint of absolute reality, also a dream. The soul is sleeping and dreaming what it calls life. And the coverings of the soul, namely the subtle senses, along with pradhan and the modes of nature, as well as functioning and interaction of these elements constitute the Lord's materially manifest form, the Virat Rup. Thus, although the bewildered soul sees matter everywhere and Krishna nowhere, everything that exists is nothing else but Krishna. When intelligence is fully under the way of material energy, it engages the mind to mundane affairs, thus submerging it in the modes of material nature. Thus, the mind is completely polluted by desires to act materially, and it sees no alternative to choosing the temporal, be it objects or activities. In such an unfortunate condition, the mind has no contact with the eternal and cannot be enlisted in its constitutional position, which is to act in the service of the Supreme. Aspiring transcendentalists know that separating the mind from the sense objects is the key to self-control, and without self-control, there is no question of meaningful sadhana for one's aspired for goal.
Yeah, let's just pause there. So that's the starting point to get on top of all of this, the regulative principles. Yeah. Despite what the mind is conditioned to, despite what impressions are there, we follow regulative principles now. Yeah. We take up regulative principles. That will give us a chance. That's the starting block. Yeah. That's the starting block. So yeah. Without self-control, there's no question of meaningful practice. Yeah. Right. Any other questions or comments on this? It's good. We're covering quite a bit here. We've got 15 minutes left. That's good. Perhaps if anyone else would like to read, they're welcome to. Let me just see who's out there who'd like to read.
I can read.
Yeah, go ahead. This is a very interesting section here. I found this nice picture here. Yeah, this is the Gani here, and this is the devotee. What kind of devotee? Anyway, let's read again. So now we've established that there has to be a principle of self-control. So now different schools will employ different methods and means for this self-control. You have the Gyanis and the Bhaktas. Yeah, so the Gyanis will follow a principle of yoga and yama and niyama, and the devotees as well. So we're going to read about that now. Yeah. So we've heard about the mess we're in. Now we're going to hear about the ways and means to overcome it. Okay. So Chandrawala, you can continue reading then.
Which pair is it? Gyanis and Bhaktas? No.
Yeah, you got it. Gyanis and Bhaktas.
Gyanis and Bhaktas both recognize the mutual attraction between the mind and the sense objects, as well as the spontaneous inclination for these two to interact. However, the way of severing the mutual attraction between mind and sense objects differs from these two sadhakas, speculator and devotee. Followers of Sankhya philosophy, as well as most kinds of yoga, recognize the dream state in which the mind vacillates. For them, knowledge of the spiritual state, the fourth state of consciousness, Brahmabhuta, beyond waking, sleeping, and deep sleep, holds the key to giving up both the mind and the sense objects. In short, the mind and sense objects should both be given up in a way that one will be freed from all material duality. Knowledge and renunciation are the ways by which these non-devotional sadhakas strive for liberation. Vaishnavas, on the other hand, know that the mind can be the best friend and most valuable instrument to attaining the perfection of prema, the fifth stage of consciousness. Therefore, a Vaishnava's approach is to engage the mind in the Lord's service. In Krishna's words, one must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. Both the fourth and the fifth stages of consciousness are described in the following chapter. In the previous chapter, we answered how the mind can be enemy. Now we address the other question arising from the same verse. How is the mind a friend and instrument for deliverance? We answer, the mind is the agent by which remembrance takes place, and remembering Krishna is the essence of sadhana. If a mind can be taught to think of Krishna's form, pastime, and qualities, better yet, if the mind develops a spontaneous attraction to such thoughts, then Nam Sankirtan quickly brings one to bow. By keeping Krishna in the mind, impurities and material inclinations of the mind, intelligence, and ego are quickly vanquished. In other words, for successful determination, sankalpas, a congenial and controlled mind is essential. For this reason, the mind must be won over as an ally.
Ally means friend. It means someone's on the same side, not an enemy.
As an ally in the war against the material energy. Otherwise, as the self-proclaimed doer and enjoyer, the mind will remain addicted to sense objects and will continue to be irresistibly attracted to the means for attaining sense gratification and false prestige. In Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna argued that the mind was not an ally, not an easy ally to win over, what to speak of to keep under control, while Krishna agreed that the restless mind was difficult to restrain. He assured his friend that it was possible by suitable practice and detachment. O mighty armed son of Kunti, it is undoubtedly very difficult to curb the restless mind, but it is possible by suitable practice and by detachment. In his purport to this verse, Srila Prabhupada writes that the foolproof practice that at once gives rise to detachment is hearing about Krishna's pastimes. By completely absorbing the intelligence in Krishna, one becomes purified and so rises to the stage of spiritual consciousness, Brahmabhuta, the fourth stage of consciousness, and from there to the fifth stage of consciousness, loving devotional service, prema bhakti. Control of the mind naturally entails self-control and gravity, and active participation by a spiritualized intelligence. When a reasonable measure of mind control has been reached, the mind becomes saturated by goodness and free from desires for material activities. Under those circumstances, devotees have the strength to give up activities born of the modes of passion and ignorance, and in due course of time that can even give up the modes of goodness. When the mind finally rises above the modes of nature, it then enters into the transcendental relationship with the Lord.
Okay, so just pause there.
I'm waiting for that last sentence.
Yeah, when the mind finally rises above the modes of nature, it then enters into transcendental relationship with the Lord. Then the mind is our friend. Yeah.
So basically, we'll wait till mind, intelligence, everything is purified, right, to Krishna conscious.
That's
At the
it.
moment, it's full of material senses.
Yeah. So that will happen according to how attentive we are to the activities of hearing and chanting. Yeah. Just like, we may be engaging in hearing and chanting, but if our mind is not controlled and we're not focused, that purification will take a lot longer. Yeah. So that's also, as well. It's an offensive to be inattentive. So yeah, but basically what you're saying is correct. Now this chapter reading now is kind of an introduction to the next few chapters. And Mother Lavanga Latika, she was asking about descriptions of intelligence. Now that's the next chapter is dedicated to that. This is chapter 11. Chapter 12 is called Empowering the Intelligence. That's this here. Yeah, that Maharaj will discuss in detail. Yeah. Okay, any questions or comments on this? And now it's a bit more positive is coming now. Krishna consciousness as the means to control the mind. Unlike the Gyani, the Bhakta absorbs the mind in Krishna. And that in of itself has purifying effects of everything, the subtle body, the gross senses, everything becomes purified. Yeah? And then hopefully at some point there'll be a spontaneous, natural proclivity to go to Krishna instead of the objects of this world. Yeah? And then we've got a few minutes left. Then there's a question which is then brought up next. Let me just look. You can continue reading, Mother Chandravali. There's no hands there. You can continue reading. Unless any other questions, please feel free to ask. Yeah. There's some nice, let's see if we get there. Perhaps we want. There's some nice verses at the end of this chapter, some prayers. Anyway, you can continue, Mother Chandravali.
Okay. Is it by keeping Krishna in mind?
At this point, the reader may ask, may pose a question.
I'm completely lost today. At this point, the reader may raise the question, does the mind, like gross senses, come into being at birth and then come to an end at death? Or is it the same mind that travels from body to body? In answering this question, we may remember that the disposition of the mind is to constantly meditate on sense objects, and it does so to the extent that it seems to enter into those sense objects and thereby identify with them. Thus, when sense objects come to an end at the death of the gross body, because of its complete identification with those objects, the mind also feels a sense of death. When at rebirth, the mind identifies with a new set of senses and sense objects, unable to discern a path beyond the current body, it perceives that birth as its first incarnation. For this reason, so long as the soul remains in the bondage, the mind does not remember that it is the same entity from body to body, casting Arjuna in the role of a conditioned soul, Krishna tells him, many, many births, both you and I have passed. I can remember all of them, but you cannot, O subduer of the enemy. Furthermore, as the mind of the living entity engages the senses with sense objects, such as wife, husband, and home, it simultaneously daydreams about other sense objects, both within his scope of experience and beyond it. Daydreams may include the heavenly planets, for example. In this way, the mind becomes habituated to these things. At the time of death, the mind is foreseeably dragged away from the objects with which it has intimately associated. And by the law of karma, it is joined to another set of senses and sense objects, undergoing a process of reorientation suited to its new environment. This reorientation to a new body and to a new
burgeoning
field of sense object is so intense that it erases the identification of the mind's previous life. Thus, the mind becomes oblivious to its past and is given the appearance of having been newly born along with the body. That said, readers know that living entities may be made aware of their past lives by mystic power, hypnotic regression, and so on. This may also spontaneously remember, may also spontaneously remember all or some of their past lives by grace of the Lord or by their karma. And the past sometimes surfaces in different ways in dreams. Thus, when we say that the mind becomes oblivious of its past, we mean that most people are not conscious of their past, although the past may remain in a subconscious stratum of their mind. Thus, the question posed is answered in this way. As regards the rebirth of the mind, all appearance aside, the truth is that the mind is the same, only its experience of the past and present circumstances are different.
Perhaps we'll pause there. It's 58, so perhaps we'll stop there for today. If there's any questions on this previous live, that's what this picture is supposed to represent.
Yes, Prabhu. Can you explain this in simple language? It was quite complicated to go through.
Yeah, well, I found it quite complicated as well, especially, yeah, I remember reading this before, that first part. Yeah, there's a sense of, in other words, the spirit soul enters into a new, it carries the mind and the intelligence and a subtle body, and it enters into a new form of life. And it seems to be fresh. It seems to be the beginning, but actually it's not. Yeah, it's actually not the beginning. That's why Marge it becomes oblivious of the past. So also it's described that the process of death itself is so traumatic. It's such a traumatic experience that one gets an amnesia of one's past life. Not just leaving the world, but also taking birth again. It's like persons who are in an accident or in a traumatic situation, they can have amnesia. Also, that's also facilitated by the supersoul. Because we can imagine the state of affairs if we could recall all our previous lives. Yeah. I mean, people get quite, you could say, quite psychotic even from the experiences in this one life, let alone if we remember all the experience of previous lives. And society could not function. Yeah, someone who dies suddenly, you know, and then they come back and they want their bank balance again, they want their house back. You can just, it will be a hellish situation. So therefore, it's not completely apparent when one takes birth again, there seems to be a death of the old mind. But actually, it's not. And then where I spoke of, there's past life, persons have past life experiences, and we experience things that come up where we cannot. For us, it's difficult to ascertain if it was a previous life or not, because, for instance, we expose ourselves, especially in this day and age, to so much stuff, so much junk. I remember when I was young at home, we just used to sit and watch a television every evening, or when I was there in the house, day after day, films and films and films. So there's so much junk gets absorbed in the mind. So some of that stuff comes up. It may be from a previous life, it may be from the junk that we exposed ourselves to before we came to Krishna consciousness. Nevertheless, whatever it is coming from the past. Yeah. And therefore, yeah. So that's as best I can do on that. Yeah, I was going somewhere on that and I forgot my train of thought. But yeah. Yeah, that's why. Yeah, that's why it cannot. That's why it doesn't function like that. That's why when we enter into, yeah, that's the point I was going to make. But you'll find the actual. We may not remember the details of our previous life, whether we lived in this house or we had that relationship or we had that job, and we lived in this country. But the overall impressions create a specific type of character. Yeah. With particular types of inclinations. Therefore, even a mother, we have a guy here, and a lot of you are mothers, so you know at some point your new or your child becomes a very distinct character, different from the sister or the brother. You know, a very distinct character comes out right in the beginning, practically. You know, that's because it's coming from, it's carrying on from, the character is carrying on from previous life. So you get what I'm explaining? So we may not remember the details, but the overall impression and the characteristics which our exposure in a previous life we had to the things of this world, that comes with us. That comes with us, and it just gets more. You can imagine, we've been in the material world, and we may have changed our bodies, which in one sense is quite good because we get a fresh body after. But what we don't get fresh is a mind. So you can imagine the state of our body if we didn't get a new body after 80 years or 70 years, what our body would look like. So we haven't, so that's the state of our mind. We haven't got a new mind. We're just carrying on. So that's why it can be quite difficult to actually deal with. But with Krishna consciousness and Krishna, taking up Krishna consciousness, that's the positive. That's how we can, again, revive our original spiritual mind and intelligence. All right, and I've gone over a couple of minutes there.
I was thinking, just quickly, I was just thinking, reading this and the explanation, you feel so happy that you getting into Krishna consciousness.
Yeah.
No, just this explanation and just reading, you know, it's like, gosh, we're not really getting out of the mess we are in, trying.
Yeah. Now we can make right decisions for our eternal well-being.
Fortunate.
Regardless of what our senses may be saying to us to do or to watch, now we can make the right choices. Yeah, and we can go forward. That's why it's very positive. Yeah,
like I just give you a quick example. Like I just got, like a while back, I got some news, right, and it was really like not nice. And I would like go normally, oh Krishna, but why is this happening? Why is this, that, whatever? But now, like realizing, you go, okay, Krishna, you're only giving us fraction of what we need. Just guide us to act in the way that you want us to act.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, yeah, it's like Krishna consciousness changes your way of thinking.
Yeah, of analyzing. And
analyze, yeah.
So therefore, it gives you a sense of detachment from the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We better stop there. We could go on more, but let's start off. I think that's enough to digest. This be careful, at least for 1 hour. We can let that sink in, and we'll come back next week and we'll continue. And I've got to put some more better pictures. You see, I've got some bit of work to do. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion. Look forward to our Krsna Katha tomorrow. I wish you all the
Thank you,
best.
Prabhu.
Thank
That was
you.
Muli Prabhu, His Grace Muli Prabhu Ki. Yeah. Vaishnavedyo Namo Namah.
Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. End meeting for all. Hare